I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Governments are often accused of failing to look beyond the next election, which is why, more than 2 decades ago, then Treasurer Peter Costello introduced the Intergenerational Report. It provides a regular gaze into the crystal ball, using the best Treasury insights to tell us what the country will look like 40 years from now. The latest report, released by Jim Chalmers on Thursday, paints a picture of a bigger, older and hotter Australia. Growth will slow and spending will rise, with those of working age carrying a heavier burden. That's unless something's done about it. The Treasurer says reform is underway across a raft of areas. But when it comes to overhauling the tax system, the government's only willing to take modest steps. Later, I'll ask the Independent member for Wentworth, Allegra Spender, about the reforms she thinks the government should take. But first to the panel, Laura Tingle, Jacob Greber and Sean Kelly. Very good morning to all of you. Just on this intergenerational report, a bit to unpack there. Laura, what's the purpose of these reports and what did this one tell us?
Well, I think the purpose of the reports, David, is to jump outside the electoral cycle and to get some of those underlying themes about what's happening in the economy. I think when they first started to come out in 2002, we all looked at the figures and went, oh my God, it's scary, run away. And, it's good for framing the discussion about whether we're spending too much, taxing enough, all those things. But the underlying things that it focuses on are the productivity of the economy, who's working, who isn't working, population, underlying
those broad trends.
Absolutely broad trends. And I think this one is interesting. Obviously, there's a lot of focus on tax, but just actually crystallising things like, resources are going sort of down the tube because of the energy transition. That's going to actually have this massive effect on our tax base. So it provides a new platform to have a discussion about what the tax system looks like.
And we'll get to tax, but Jacob, what else is the government doing? What did we hear from the Treasurer in response to this report about how they're addressing these challenges?
Yeah, I think this is the difficulty with the report coming out 2 years after the last one. It wasn't clear what's really changed in terms of those big picture things you mentioned, other than the climate thing is a big driver. And the problem for the government is these are problems being identified that require very big decisions to be made. The trick, of course, is it's in 40 years' time or over 40 years' time. But at some point, you've got to face up to some pretty big issues. And it seems the government is heading in the opposite direction to what those issues require.
What do you mean by that?
Well, 2 things spring to mind. One is, at the moment, there's a big push on industrial relations. That will, the business community's worried that's going to make things harder to employ people. So that's gumming the system up. That's not a productivity booster, they say. And the second thing is really on tax reform. Everyone knows the income tax burden's going up. Ken Henry made it very clear again this week, that's falling on the young generation. Kids today will be 40 and 50 at the end of this period. They'll be paying through the nose. And the government, Jim Chalmers in particular, would love nothing more than to reverse stage 3. That flies exactly against what this report's suggesting needs to be.
Well, just to be clear, that's not what he says publicly. He says our plans have not changed. You think otherwise?
He's had a couple of cracks at getting that one turned over.
Right.
The government's position is not to change it, but there's a big push to change it coming from all sorts of groups. But this report, the IGR's made clear, that would worsen the intergenerational problem, not make it better.
Well, it does make it clear, this report, that in 40 years' time, that income tax burden will be greater. We'll be relying more on income tax, a lot more than we are right now. And clearly that's not fair on working age Australians down the track. Look, the Treasurer, though, argues that future governments will ultimately address this.
Obviously, next year there are legislated tax cuts. Between next year and 2063, governments, I think, of both political persuasions will take decisions to return some or all of the bracket creep that we see in the economy, and so that number will change over time.
Sean, what do you think? Is he saying, that's a problem for future governments, or is this something we might get around to down the track?
I think there is every chance this government will go to those things, but I think it's important to zoom out for a second. I think it's really interesting. We've kind of started this discussion talking about tax and industrial relations. I think intergenerational reports are more or less meaningless in a sense. Their message is always things are bad and they're going to get worse without action. Fair enough. So in some ways, the really important thing is what the government says. That's the interesting feature. And I think the most interesting thing that Jim Chalmers said all week was the productivity debate has been dominated by industrial relations almost exclusively, with a little bit of a focus on tax. And the conversation needs to shift away to all of the other areas, which is, as Laura pointed out this week, meet together, fit together.
So what are those, just to explain to people, what are those other areas where the government thinks they can find productivity growth? Is that very clear?
Well, I mean, he's got a list of 8 things and a list of 5 things, and I can't remember.
5 big shifts.
AI versus. But I mean, I think the really big one that they're focusing on. I mean, just to take up the other point, the big shift in this policy is about climate change, and I think that does show a reset of the policy. But I think the really big thing that we're going to be seeing in this term is about migration. I mean, we've heard talk about this. We're going to see it in the next couple of months. The government announced this shift in international students policy yesterday. We've got several ministers working on this now, Claire O'Neill, Brendan O'Connor and Jason Clare. They're basically looking at a complete reworking of the migration system, because about 700,000 people are now in Australia as students. They're now basically dominating our permanent migration scheme. It's really hard to come in as a high-skilled migrant, as a permanent migrant. I think the argument within the government is now, how do we completely shift this so that the people who are coming in are actually not only as a migration thing boosting the economy, but actually boosting our productivity.
But I mean, let's be honest though. I mean, yes, you might be able to find some extra productivity by getting better skilled migrants, getting older people to work more. I mean, these things need to be tried. They have been tried many times, and maybe some new ideas. But you can't take tax and IR off the table when we talk about what this report is showing. They need to be discussed.
No, well, you can't. But I mean, I think the thing is, I think what the Treasurer is saying is, look, we always just go back to this. Like everybody goes, oh, let's lift the GST rate. I think what he's trying to say is, look, they're not the same questions as they were in the 1980s. So we've got to, by definition, have different answers. Now, a la the income tax mix, the fact that we're going to have this massive imposted income tax relative to other taxes, that is a different issue and requires different answers to just purely being one about changing from income to GST, when the people who are paying income tax, even the mix between personal income tax and company tax is different.
Well, you can tax income, you can tax spending through the GST, and then you can tax assets. And this is kind of the debate, well, something Bill Shorten tried to do from opposition, right?
Yeah, you got to...
Negative gearing, capital gains tax, franking credits, these all go to taxing assets. But is there any appetite on either side to do that, Jacob?
Not at this point. There's not a lot of interest for anyone on any side of the spectrum to solve this problem, because the contest keeps them all in a job, if I was to be really cynical about it. But I mean, even on income tax, you can argue that is a big deal on the whole immigration question.
Yes.
We are in a global contest for talent. And if we have a sort of tax structure that the bright engineer overseas is making a choice between Canada, Europe, the United States, if we have a very inefficient tax system that hits them harder here, that's going to be a struggle.
But if the bright engineer can't actually even get permanent migration here, it doesn't matter. So, I mean, I think that's a really big issue.
But on assets, home ownership is obviously a big part of what we're talking about when we're talking about assets and changing taxation. I thought one of the most interesting things was the way the report stitched together housing with pressures on the age pension. Because home ownership, if people don't own homes when they're older, they end up renting, they end up spending more of their money on rent, they have less wealth because they don't own a home. That puts more pressure on the age pension and on super. And I think what's really interesting about that is it slowly starts to shift the debate away from who owns homes and who doesn't, which is pretty divisive, to actually this is a cost on all of us in terms of the age pension system.
At the end of the day, this question about the government's appetite for reform, how willing it is to chance its arm here is an interesting one. And this sort of report inevitably takes us to that question. And there was an interesting moment from Jim Chalmers at the press club on stage with you there, Laura, where he wants to be seen as a reformer. He doesn't want to be seen as risk averse. And look, he talks about this pilot light of purpose that's burning within him. It sounded a little bit like the light on the hill.
When you spend as much time as we all do, away from away from kids and families. You know, dragging our asses around airports at 4:30 in the morning, getting the first flight, and, you know, cursing the alarm when it goes off at 3:45 or whatever it is. You know, the thing that justifies it in our minds is the idea that being away from your kids, at least you're trying to create something that you can give to them and be proud of. If you don't have that sense of the future, kind of that flame kind of flickering in you, you know, if you don't have that pilot light of purpose in you, then you've got no business being here in our line of work.
Jacob, it's not a raging inferno, it's a
my
flickering.
little pilot light, the smallest light in the house. Just behold it.
But what do you read into the fact that he does point to this this pilot light as does that indicate that he, and you mentioned he might have views on stage 3 tax cuts that others in government don't share, that he wants to go a bit further down the track?
I reckon he'd love to turn that pilot light into an inferno, you know, with the right amount of gas. You get the sense from this Treasurer he's looking for the pathway to make some big changes. And when things are sort of rumbling along nicely, it's very hard politically to stir people up for the big change.
Well,
the
it is right now.
pandemic's a great
I made the
example.
point earlier, you've got a lot going on right now. You've got a referendum, you've got all these issues.
You do, but like the burning platform to really massage this whole this image isn't there just yet. And so it's very hard to do the things that one suspects he wants to do. He talks about wanting a conversation incessantly. But I think that's really about expanding government.
Do we get that at the next election? Do you think, is this a second term agenda they're likely to lay out, or are they going to be too worried about what Peter Dutton will do?
There's kind of a technical political challenge, which is you don't do it this term because Albanese is very clear that he only does what he promises to do in an election. Then you don't promise it at the next election because, again, the Prime Minister is very clear that governments tend to go backwards at the first election, and that would push them back in a minority. And then you're in the second term, and then again you're tied to what you promised at the election.
And then we're 10 years down the track and nothing's happened.
But I don't think the government has completely ruled things out. I think there is a chance of some action this term, not a big bang, but I think there is a chance. I don't think stage 3 are entirely set in stone. And I do think there is a pretty good chance that in the second term we will see something larger. But I do think it will be more creative than the ways we are used to thinking about tax reform.
And the path through is at the next election you say, well, you know, we should have a discussion. And the famous white paper, you know, option gets dragged out again, so that you set up a tax discussion for the next term, which may end up being something you take to the next election. But at least there'll be a formalised process.
And at least they could go back to the Henry report, which has barely been touched, so dust that off. What about the coalition in all of this? They really, I mean, economic management's meant to be their thing, but they really went missing on this debate this week. They said we should be focused on the next 40 days, not the next 40 years. This is a Trojan horse, it was said, for higher taxes. Shouldn't they be engaging in this sort of economic debate, Laura?
Well, you'd think so, but they're not engaging very much in anything at the moment other than The Voice, are they? I mean, so we've had them sort of come out and say, oh, it's secret language and things like that, but it is interesting, as you say. I mean, they're supposed to be the superior economic managers. The polls show that they've lost that in the last 12 months to Labor, and it doesn't feel like they're putting a lot of intellectual effort into actually sort of saying, OK, well, here's somewhere we can position ourselves for the next campaign yet. Yeah, no,
it's understandable to focus on cost of living right now, but these sort of opportunities talk about the longer term and where the economy is going and what should happen. I mean, we heard from a number in the opposition, Jacob, saying spending should be the focus. But can we really avoid the sort of spending growth that an ageing population is going to bring?
Not without a bigger population, you know.
Not without a big migration increase.
Not without a big migration increase, a big population increase to sort of maintain that balance that we talked about earlier, working versus retired. But look, I think the coalition is onto something though with the whole cost of living thing. I mean, that is a genuine concern. And when the government's talking about esoteric problems in the future and not the here and now, that's a political vulnerability for them. I mean, as a country, we should be able to sort of chew gum and walk at the same time on these things, but politically, it does work.
I would say in the coalition's defence, 18 months after a major loss, after 8 years in government, can they really be expected to have done a lot of long-term thinking? I think probably not. You might let them off the hook a little bit on that. I think the bigger problem is they're still reflexively blocking things. An old colleague of mine made the point to me, and I think he's absolutely right, that they haven't learned what an opposition eventually learns, which is you have to choose your issues very carefully. And I think that's a real problem for Peter Dutton in particular, because it hasn't defined him in any way. He's still just a bit of a blur, I think, because he's everywhere, which also adds up to nowhere.
Well, time to talk to the Independent MP Allegra Spender, and to take us there, here was the Treasurer, followed by the Productivity Commissioner, on the prospects of tax reform.
We think the most fertile ground for tax reform is multinationals, high balance superannuation, compliance, cigarettes, and PRRT reform, and we're releasing that draft legislation today. We've made our priorities clear when it comes to tax reform. There's a huge amount of common ground that we can work with the BCA on outside the GST.
When we've seen successful efforts at tax reform in Australia in the past, most recently in the early 2000s, it had a long build-up, and there was a lengthy process of intellectual consensus building that led to it. I think a little unfair to throw all this back on government and say, well, why aren't you out there leading a debate? Why aren't you out there taking grand political risks? I think we often need to help build a bit of that community consensus so the government can then act on it.
Allegra Spender, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, David.
Now, you've been one of the few in Parliament trying to generate a broader debate about tax reform. Can I ask, to what end? What's the main problem that you think needs fixing?
I think there are two really big issues in our tax system at the moment. I think, and they're around equity across generations and within generations, and it's also about productivity. And tax is quite profound in its impact there. When you look at, let's start with fairness and generations. I agree that we have urgent issues now, but I think our tax system is playing into those, and it's actually young people who are facing already the implications of the Intergenerational Report. Young people are doing it harder, they're having a harder time, and our tax system is really driving into that. I had a young man in my office just the other week, and he said, look, I think I'm doing everything right. He said, I've gone to uni, I'm starting a job, but I don't see a path to me having secure, housing to be able to buy a house. And I think this is the challenge that we have now, and it's only going to be exacerbated into the future. Young people are feeling abandoned by the tax system, by the housing system, and I think the tax system has to play a part in addressing that.
So just sticking on that issue of the tax system, what sort of change is required?
Look, I think that what I'm trying to do is actually say, let's have some of that big conversation. And it is because I think you've outlined this morning, the major parties have wedged themselves so effectively on tax that no one can say anything. And so what I've done to date is I've got together people from the key economists like Ken Henry, like Ross Garnaut, leading businesses and business community groups, but also social sector, unions and those groups, and bringing them together and say, what are the challenges we see in the tax system and how can you play out? And an example of one where so far there's, I think, a really strong consensus is that stamp duty, for example. There's, I think, broad consensus across the community and across the sort of business and social sectors that stamp duty is a tax which really holds back home ownership for young people. New South Wales Treasury says that we would have 7% greater home ownership if we reform stamp duty and replace with a land tax.
Well, that's at a state level, but just sticking with the federal level, do you agree that income taxes need to be reduced and we either tax spending or assets more?
I think that the Intergenerational Report really highlights the problem with our reliance on income tax. So yes, I see there's a real challenge on our reliance on income tax. It's at a it's at a historical high, over 50% now. It'll get to 58%, I think, in the Intergenerational Report if we don't do anything, and that is on the basis of fewer and fewer working age people being in the population. So I think it's pretty clear. We can't keep on relying on workers. And Ken Henry was right. We're setting ourselves up for an intergenerational tragedy where young people have high HECS debts. They're going to have to pay for climate change. They're going to have to pay for extremely high costs of housing, and then we're going to rely on them more and more and more to carry everybody else.
So does that mean going back to these issues of taxing, the way we tax capital gains, investment properties, franking credits and so on, are those the sort of areas we need to look at?
Look, I think everything needs to be on the table. and I'm running a process because we're not having a conversation nationally enough about this, and the major parties are scared of it. And I'm running a process, and I think, I believe that everything should be on the table. GST should be on the table. Capital gains tax should be on the table. These are issues that we all have to face and say, well, what are the implications, both for sort of fairness, but also for productivity and making actually the economy run better? Because if we can drive productivity, we can also drive wages and our ability to spend on the things that really matter to us.
You represent, of course, the wealthiest, if not one of the wealthiest electorates in the country. What do your local constituents say when you suggest that all these things should be on the table, including capital gains tax and the way their assets are taxed?
Look, I think that, my community is more diverse than people think. You've got 60% of my community are in apartments, 45% are renters. So it's more mixed than you think. But I had a lot of older Australians who say, I just don't know how my kids are going to ever be able to afford a home or live near me. I think there's a real concern that the generations, that are coming up right now are not doing well enough. And so I think there are a lot of people, I've had people just last week, people, in good careers with good levels of assets who said, look, it's not in my interest, but I actually believe we should look at these things because it's in the national interest. And I think, Australians and people in Wentworth are willing to have a broader view on what's in our national interest.
Well, to that end, let's go to a couple of things that are on the table right now. Which way are you going to vote on the government's superannuation tax change to increase the tax on the biggest super balances?
I'm going to have to wait to see what the legislation looks like. The principle
you must have
of
an
saying,
idea. I mean, this has been debated for a long time.
Yeah, and I'd say the principle of saying, adjusting the super system so it's really focused on saving for retirement is one that I support. But the idea of taxing unrealised capital gains, I think, is bad tax policy, to be honest. So I'm seeing where we go. I think if it was something that was much more just saying, look, you're taxing, increasing the tax rate of big balances, that's something I would support. It's the unrealised gains, which I think is really concerning to me, and that's what I want to see in the detail, how the government's going to do that.
Okay, but at the moment you wouldn't support taxing unrealised gains?
I need to see the detail on this one. I think, I said I'm open to reducing concessions on super for very big balances, because we need to move to a system where it's more equitable between the generations. And I want to flag something on that. Why I think this is important is if you look at Grattan Institute did some great analysis that showed from 2004 to 2016, households headed by people over the age of 65 had about a 50% increase in wealth. Households headed by people under the age of 35 had pretty much no change in wealth. And I think that, I take that to anyone in Parliament and challenge them. Is that the system we're setting up, that we want older Australians to, to be accelerating compared to younger Australians? Don't we want the generations to be, sharing prosperity together? And that's why I think this issue is actually really serious and right now.
Well, one of the other serious and right now proposals the government has on the table is the multinational tax reform. It's introduced legislation trying to stop multinationals profit shifting offshore.
Sure.
You moved an amendment which the government says would keep the loophole open. Even the coalition wouldn't back you on your amendment. Are you unwilling to crack down on multinational tax avoidance?
Not at all. My amendment was, the reason why I moved that amendment was because it hadn't been consulted. And, I made that really clear in my speech. I think if you're going to get proper tax reform, you actually need to make sure everyone's in the room and discussing it properly.
Well, okay, the government, to be clear, says there's plenty of consultation through the department, through the process.
And I'd say that, the Senate inquiry is now looking at this improper. And I said, that's what I said, just hold it up, take this part out and do the consultation on it properly, because that part of the legislation hadn't been in the draft, it hadn't been in the draft exposure bills. But, the principle, absolutely, we should make sure that Australian companies and Australian, families are not disadvantaged by multinationals avoiding tax. 100% agree with the point, but it's just a matter of getting that detail right.
But it does sound like on both superannuation and multinationals, where the government is trying to make some change, you're yet to actually sign up.
No, not at all. I said on the multinational tax piece, I think that they just need to consult on a part of that legislation, and it's pretty technical. And it sounds, it's a great line to say, oh, you're against multinational tax. Not at all. It was a technical issue, and I really, I don't like that. But on the superannuation point, I said I'm up for it, but we just have to look at the detail of the legislation and make sure that's right. But to be honest, I think the government's missed a trick. The government could have gone harder or broader on super and said, what are we doing to set up our super in a longer term way that is better for different generations? And I think they decided not to do that. I think that's the shame.
On industrial relations, the government's set to later this week reveal the latest tranche of its workplace relations reforms. We don't know all the details yet, but part of this will go to trying to close a loophole where employers can pay labour hire workers less than a regular employee. Do you agree there's a case for change here, or do you have concerns?
Look, I think that there is a I accept that there is a case for change to look at our labour system, and I think that's appropriate. But I think the question again, like I say, the devil's on the detail, because in industrial relations reform, if you push it through really, really fast, which the government did before Christmas, then you get what you got in before Christmas, which is 100 amendments, and still unintended consequences playing out right now. So I think that it is the principle. I think is a reasonable principle. Let's make sure that it actually practically works, so you're not capturing businesses that aren't meant to be captured under that. But also, and I think this is a challenge I make to the government, is what are they doing in terms of making it easier to run businesses? Because they're making, I think, in some cases, appropriate changes to the industrial relations base. But at the same time, they do not have an agenda which is around trying to make it easier to run a business and actually easier to employ people. I've been arguing with Tony Burke, the Industrial Relations Minister, why don't you make the award system simpler? Because the ABC, the RBA, and his own employment, department has gotten into trouble for paying people wrongly, and that's because of the complexity of industrial relations system. And I think that's absolutely what the government needs to put on the agenda: make it easier to run a business, because that drives productivity as well.
You wrote to Tony Burke on behalf of the crossbench, I think about 10 days ago, asking for longer consultation than we had in that first tranche before Christmas. Have you had a response from the Minister?
Look, we've had a verbal response saying that we will have greater time, so okay. We'll see where that goes in terms of how long that is, and I think business is also seeking that as well.
Right, and did he give you a time frame as to how long?
Not at this stage.
Okay, we'll see. Now, housing, you've mentioned that already as a real concern for renters in your electorate, concern for renters everywhere. Just where do you stand on the ideas that the Greens have put forward of a rent freeze or rent cap? What do you think?
Look, I think the Greens have identified, absolutely rightly, that renters are doing it really tough right now. And frankly, renting has changed. We now have 50% of single-parent families are in renting. But I think the problem that we have, with the Greens proposal, the problem I have with the Greens proposal is just they're not going to solve the problem. They sound good, like lots of housing policy in the past, but they're not going to solve the problem, because supply is critical to solving the problem of housing. And I commend the government what they're starting to do on supply. But I think that if you had a rent freeze right now, what you would see is you'd see a bunch of people being pushed out of their homes because they can do it, a bunch of houses being sold, and increasing dilapidated response. And then finally, what you'd see also is I think you would see fewer and fewer houses being built because of uncertainty of the return. So I think we need to grow supply. I think we need to, but give renters more protections and help them have longer term rents. And then finally, I think we need to address things like the taxes on property, including something like stamp duty. Just
finally, Allegra Spender, I'd like to just ask you about how you and your fellow independents are travelling as we approach the midway point of this parliamentary term. There's a lot of buzz, of course, around the Teal success at the last election, but without that Morrison factor there's a question as to how well you'll go next time around. What is the strategy from here? What are the issues? What's the sort of pathway to staying in the seats that you've won?
I think the pathway is doing a really good job for the communities that you represent, because I think communities are sick of politics as usual, where it seems like the parties are fighting amongst themselves about who did this, who you can blame for that. And frankly, I've sat through so much question time where you go, you're just having an argument amongst yourselves.
You don't think anything's changed since the last Parliament?
Look, I think it's better from what I hear, but it needs to be much better. Because I think the community says, you know, come together, work constructively on what's important. And so that's why I'm dealing with tax, because I think that we absolutely need to make sure that we support, you know, future generations. We need to give them voice, but we also need to make sure that we can deal with the difficult
that's
tax
interesting.
reform issues.
So tax is going to be a frontline issue for you in terms of the next election.
Absolutely, tax is going to be a frontline issue. But and I think because no one else is talking about tax reform, you know, across the major parties right now, because they're too scared and it's too much wedging. But the IGR said this week we have to deal with it. And frankly, if you talk to young people right now, they'll say we have to deal with it right now. And that's why I think it's really, really important.
And just strategically, are you and your fellow independents better off remaining independent of each other, working together as much as you do, or even coming together as a new moderate party?
I think what we're trying to do is actually work together and work across the parliament. To be honest, I've worked with the Labor Party, I've worked with the Coalition, I've worked with the Greens, a crossbench in the House and the Senate, and all those things make coming together actually is what you do in terms of being constructive. That's what you do in business, in real life,
But
and that's what I try and do.
No talk of forming a party.
No, we're not. I'm here as representing Wentworth. That's what I said I was going to do, and that's what I'm going to do.
And you will go around next time. You'll seek re-election.
Yeah, look, I love the work, and I think that this is a really important time. But I think it's a really important time to face the tough issues and not just hide behind sort of basically the party politics, because a bunch of people in this country are saying you don't represent me. You're not in there for the long term. You're more interested in your party and wedging the opposition, or wedging the government, than you are in terms of dealing what's most important. And I think that's why people elected me.
Allegra Spender, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, David.
Coming up, the great controversy over ticks and crosses. Peter Dutton is outraged. He says it stinks, the rules around how referendum votes will be counted. We'll come to that. Let's continue this conversation, though, and back to our panel, Laura Tingle, Jacob Greber and Sean Kelly. I think it is interesting that tax is now identified there, Laura, as the sort of issue for the independents. Last time it was integrity and climate change, treatment of women. Is tax a pathway, do you think, for the Teals?
Well, it's really interesting, isn't it, that that Allegra Spender says that she's going to take tax to the election even if nobody else is. And I think it reflects what she's saying about the nature of her electorate and the fact that the electorate is changing. Voters are getting younger. Voters are changing their perspectives, as we saw with the support for Teals and the Greens. And they do sort of see the intergenerational inequity. So I think that's a bit of a wake-up call for the government as much as anybody else, in that, even if they don't want to talk about tax at the next election, they're going to be dragged kicking and screaming to do so.
So two things struck me. You could have a minority government after the next election. People like Allegra Spender will be in the box seat if she gets re-elected. And point number two, she's talking about tax in a way the government is not necessarily. She's talking about the purpose of tax, whether it's the different tax items. What is the policy purpose? It's not just about revenue. No, it's about linking it. I mean, she links it with housing and these pressures, and the demographics are changing in seats like hers. Yes, you have a lot of wealth, but you've got a lot of renters coming in, and that's a number that's growing, isn't it, Sean? So
yeah, absolutely. You have renters and you have young people. George Megalogenis was making this really interesting point yesterday, which is that cities are becoming much more electorally important. They are dominated by young people as regions continue to become older. What that means is that for the first time, you're actually getting to a point where the political equation might be in favour of acting for young people, and that is not a situation we've had before. We've just had problems without really the chance of a political solution. Speaking of young people, the NAPLAN results that came out during the week, and this sort of feeds into the whole productivity debate too, right? They're still disappointing. The headline takeout was that is it 2/3 of schoolgoers are meeting or passing the minimum standards on literacy and numeracy, so a third aren't. And again, questions around why all the extra spending over the last couple of decades hasn't really improved the results. Laura, is there a clear answer on what's going wrong?
Apparently not enough reading, writing and arithmetic or grammar. I mean, I remember in the 70s my 6th class teacher was sort of closing the blinds before he taught us grammar because it was already out of fashion then. But I think, I don't know, I'm not an education expert, but I suppose what really strikes you is there doesn't seem to be a correlating political debate about education standards that you would expect. You can't immediately say, oh, well, I know what everybody says we should be doing about this. So that to me was the striking thing about this week. I mean, you had individual teachers coming out and saying, oh, if we do something different, it improves things. But, there doesn't seem to be either at a federal or state level some sort of sense of, gosh, we need to be doing something.
Here's what we need to do. And look, some have pointed out there were changes made earlier this year to the way NAPLAN runs, online testing, so that was always going to produce an issue with the sort of results. But look, Jason Clare's taking, the Education Minister's taking this pretty seriously, it's clear. He's worried about that cohort that aren't meeting the standard, and within that cohort, those who are only going to fall further and further behind.
Only 1 in 5 children who are below the minimum standard in primary school are above it by high school. And as a result, a lot of those children drop out and don't finish high school. And this is happening at a time where we need almost everybody to finish high school, because that's what you're going to need to get the jobs in the economy that lies ahead.
So he's got to negotiate a new school funding agreement with the states next year. Sean, is it clear where he's heading?
I think there is some clarity that if there is a through line to Jason Clare's rhetoric about education, it is about poor students and students in regions and the fact that they have been below where they should be. And it is important to note as well that schools debate is happening alongside 2 other very important reports, a report about early childhood education and a report about universities. All of those will be handed down before mid-next year. So the government's knitting these things up in each of those areas. Jason Clare talks about equality, and that's a very big shift over the last couple of decades from John Howard's rhetoric, which was all about choice, particularly in schools, parents and choice, to equality and the fact that poor students.
And it's also different to, I mean, the Gillard debate was all about funding, really, and those Gonski funding reforms. And yes, that's linked to it. But Jason Clare's now talking too about more micro issues like small group tutoring to catch up those kids that he talks about there. The opposition, meanwhile, the Shadow Minister Sarah Henderson is arguing that explicit instruction needs to be rolled out in every classroom. She thinks the approach of inquiry-based learning just hasn't worked.
We've had an era of inquiry-based learning, loose learning, that does not serve Australian students. And frankly, Australian students and their families and our country deserves better. So
loose learning, Jacob, is the issue.
Yeah, well, this problem certainly didn't come up overnight. So if this was happening, it was happening under the former government's watch. This drift, maybe they couldn't negotiate with the unions about the sort of standards or the style of teaching that we're now being told will solve these NAPLAN shortfalls. There is now a debate happening about certain schools trying a new thing, which is actually kind of sounds like an old thing. And they're getting good results, and I think that'll continue to drive this debate. It also shows that money hasn't been the big solve-all. It's much more complex than that. I mean, and it goes to, teacher training as well.
Look, this is old-fashioned of me, but I thought the state sort of actually ran the schools.
Yeah.
I mean, I know the feds fund private schools, but this is a state issue, isn't it?
And I think so. And you can see the tension. New South Wales is now disappointing teachers. The new government made promises. They're struggling to find the money for that, and so that tension's not going away.
I think it's important to say money is never a catch-all solution. It's not a silver bullet, but it has to go to the right places, and it's been going to the wrong places. Yeah. Non-government schools are doing better than the Gonski standard. Government schools are still below the Gonski standard, and that needs to shift.
And particularly those schools you mentioned earlier in regional, remote areas as well. Look, the Prime Minister will on Wednesday announce the referendum date for the Voice. Everyone expects October 14. I don't think there'll be any great surprise there. But this week we saw, quite a kerfuffle over these comments from the Electoral Commissioner about how to vote.
Please make sure you write on that box yes or no in English. Now, there are some savings provisions, but I need to be very clear with people. When we look at that, it is likely that a tick will be accepted as a formal vote.
A tick, it will be accepted. Right, yes or no, but a tick would be accepted, and a cross, more ambiguous, won't be accepted as a no. Now, the AEC says those rules haven't changed for 30 years. That's always been the case. The opposition leader thinks, though, this is going to seriously advantage the yes case.
I just think it just stinks, to be honest. And I think the AEC Commissioner here really needs to step up and exert his independence and give a sensible interpretation, one that doesn't favour the yes case or the no case. I respect that people will vote yes or no in this, and that's their entitlement. But I don't think we should have a process that's rigged, and that's what the Prime Minister's tried to orchestrate from day one.
And that led to this slapdown from the AEC. They issued this statement saying the AEC completely and utterly rejects the suggestions by some that by transparently following the established public and known legislative requirements, we're undermining the impartiality and fairness of the referendum. As I say, these have been the rules for 30 years, they say, and at the last referendum more than 20 years ago, it was less than 1% that were actually informal votes. Sean, what's going on here? Do you think this is a genuine concern from Peter Dutton, or is he just trying to muddy the waters, undermine trust in the process? It is absolutely not a genuine concern. This is of a piece with the entire campaign that the No campaign has been running pretty much from day one, which is it is about other issues. Let's take any other issue we can, make it about that, and make it as confusing as we possibly can. And on the way through suggest there's a bit of a government elites conspiracy. Now, there are some reasonable arguments you can make against a voice, but we're not hearing any of those. We are hearing all of the arguments around the edge, and this is just another one of those, and I think it's pretty disgraceful. Yeah, Jacob, what do you think? I mean, look, just remind everybody, right yes, right no, you're not meant to do anything else.
Yes, yeah. And if you put a cross, it won't be taken as a no necessarily. Why was this issue not dealt with the machinery legislation?
Just
is my first question. Yeah. That sounds like political malpractice that got through, and the coalition didn't notice it and didn't make a noise about it at the time. I think the other thing is it shows you, we keep getting told by both sides that the vote's incredibly soft. So now we're heading into this almost US-style vibe of suppressing the other side's vote. Now we do have a compulsory system in this country, and you get fined, I think, I'm not sure, if you don't vote.
Yeah, you do.
So are we heading into that sort of realm now?
Well, does it head into the realm of attacking what is a highly respected independent election authority in Australia? Yeah, well, exactly. It's completely outrageous. I mean, as that statement said, this has been established practice for 30 years. It's, legislated. The coalition, if it was at all concerned about this, had an opportunity in the legislation governing this referendum to do something about it, and it chose not to. What are they going to do if they don't like the result? Are they going to sort of basically suggest that there's something dodgy about it? Well, they've suggested everything else about the voice is dodgy. So, I mean, I think that I find this really disturbing, not just because of, what it does in terms of the voice referendum, but in terms of, once again, attacking institutions. I mean, these guys are supposed to be the Conservatives. They're supposed to be protecting and respecting institutions. And another point, does putting an X always mean no? Politicians have to fill out a form, right, to show they constitutionally are eligible to sit in Parliament. They don't breach Section 44. Here's Peter Dutton's form, by the way, that he filled out. Right down the bottom there, are you eligible to sit? Yes, with an X. There you go. All right. That's awkward. Maybe we're sending kisses. All about affection. Look, Qantas posted a record profit on Friday, nearly $2.5 billion. Followed a government decision, though, last month, rejecting a request from Qatar Airways to almost double their capacity in Australia, their flights in and out of the country. And it must be said the government's explanations as to why the Transport Minister made that decision to block that extra competition, the explanations are a bit thin.
In her view, in the government's view, the proposal before us wasn't maximising the national interest.
I mean, it's quite remarkable, and there's been no decision given that is logical, and additional capacity in the system and that competition will bring downward pressure on prices.
Jacob, the opposition says the government's running a protection racket on behalf of Qantas. What do you reckon?
You certainly get that sense. I mean, if you talk to the really smart people in the government behind the scenes, they don't even try to defend this decision. They won't even have a go at it. It's so bad. This is an airline that wraps itself in the flag at the first opportunity. In the middle of the pandemic, plumped with government money, they disappeared. I know this personally because I had to get my family back from the United States.
That's right, you did.
It was American carriers and New Zealand carriers that brought us back. So I don't understand why the government's doing this for this particular airline and shielding them from what looks to me like increasing competition.
I mean, it says other airlines are expanding their capacity over the next 6 or 12 months, but that doesn't explain why you block this one that was on the table to boost competition.
It doesn't at all. Qantas is aligned with Emirates. Qatar is one of their major competitors. We don't have enough capacity. Prices are terrible. You know, just in pure competition grounds, you can't possibly understand why they've made this decision. And the fact is, as Jacob says, there's no good explanation for it. And I think the fact that it's happened at the same time as they're announcing a competition review and Qantas announces this booming profit just makes it smell even worse than it otherwise would. Yeah, the timing and then producing that big profit number, not great for this whole thing. Sean, what do you reckon? I mean, Qatar is also, of course, aligned with Virgin, which wanted to see this expansion as well. Qantas did not.
Look, I would say this government, every government is too close to Qantas. So I would say Qantas are masters at the kind of combination of bullying and cajolery. I think they are absolutely too powerful in this country. I am interested, it is too early to draw conclusions, but I'm interested to see the IR laws on Thursday and the week after that, because Qantas are clearly one of the targets of the labour hire laws that Tony Burke is unveiling. So how harsh they end up being, I think, is an interesting question. If they're quite weak, obviously, this will double down the criticism coming at the government right now. Yeah, well, that will be interesting to see. We'll be talking a lot more about those IR reforms next Sunday, you can be sure of that. All right. Our panel, Sean Kelly, Jacob Greber and Laura Tingle, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Cathy Wilcox. Very warm welcome.
Good morning, Mike. Good to be here.
Cathy, the government's Intergenerational Report has given a whole new meaning to One Day Son. All this will be yours. It's like, do we have the skills to pay the bills in 2063?
Nice little slogan. Can you have that put on a T-shirt?
Beautiful Matt Golding, whose simplicity of drawing is lovely, isn't it?
Yeah, like getting the nostril in Albo's nose, and the way the ears turn down. Meanwhile, he's obviously just to do Dutton is easy, just put your finger down and draw around.
2023 vision, next election or acting on the Intergenerational Report. It requires some rose-coloured gloves. I think they're covering one eye up there, aren't they?
Yeah, that must be what's going on.
Cathy, there's not just a generation gap, there is also a widening chasm between those that have and those that haven't. Megan has summed this up beautifully. She's changed the short-term parking to the long-term housing.
For the families having to sleep in their cars, perhaps, and for sale, too expensive, for rent, too expensive, for public housing, sorry, that's full. And the overflow, 170,000.
David Pope cartoons don't fill her up, and I found this quite depressing, really, because he's got the shopping trolley showroom with the little family sedan, which is the normal size trolley, and the big SUV Raptor executive grocery profits truck.
Yes, and not a shred of modesty about the Raptor purchases. I don't suspect.
Cathy, the evidence of climate change is undeniable, but political change is another thing.
Chris Minns has decided that he wants to prolong the life of the Ererang power station beyond its expected closure. And we know what the federal government is doing with regard to opening more coal
So they've turned
projects.
up at the IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.
Maybe we can just get some special conditions put in. Excuse me, we were wondering if you could slow down the warming a bit. We Australians are not quite ready to give up on the fossil fuel. And I mean, isn't that fair? If you want, you just ask.
Perfectly reasonable.
Nothing to lose.
Yep. Look, the coalition is embracing nuclear, repetitive toxic relationships, as the opposition leader here is off arm in arm with nuclear power. And is this 666? Is that the devil?
I think you're drawing a long bow there, Mike. But no, I think that's it's a bunch of irradiated flowers or things.
But it's definitely love, right?
It's love.
Mr. Shakespeare, the temperature is rising, the sea is rising, your credit rating is tanking.
How can I help? That caught their attention this week. The fact that it could risk our credit rating. It could cost us, like in some hundreds of billions of dollars.
I did love Warren Brown, who's got Mark Latham getting the Gough tattoo crossed out previously, the Hanson tattoo, Pauline. Just right, Mark, I'm going independent.
Yeah, well, you're running out of room, fella.
Yeah. Yeah. Finally, Cathy, the Minister for Defence Industry needs to not stand in front of an Anzac-class frigate where you can make the words warmonger. HMAS Warramunga turns into warmonger if you make his head... it's quite...
Yeah, it is.
David Shoebridge, the Senator, has tweeted no comment, which is a comment in itself.
It is.
Yeah, that's very clever.
It is.
Always a great pleasure unpicking the events of the week. I'll let you do the honours.
Thanks, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Sean.
Last week, the Queensland Labor government passed laws almost secretly, absolutely deliberately avoiding scrutiny to make it legal for them to continue keeping children in Queensland watch houses rather than youth detention centres. These watch houses are disgraceful places. There was a Four Corners program on them 3 years ago. Children are kept in absolutely atrocious conditions. They are children because, of course, most of this country has continued to fail to raise the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14. So we're talking about kids as young as 10. A lot of them are going to be Indigenous kids because that's the way the justice system works. This is an atrocious thing the government has done, and of course it also means they've conceded that they've effectively been acting illegally for the last few years.
And it's one of the issues that stirred up the Labor ranks in Queensland as well. Absolutely. When it comes to Anastasia Palaszczuk's leadership. Jacob?
For years now, it's been my view that we've been running a bit of a weak dollar policy. We've had high commodity prices, but surprisingly not a dollar that went to parity like it did 10 years ago when we had that first big wave. The consequences of that are now coming home to roost. The dollar is under massive pressure. It's falling. And the consequence is it's driving up costs of everything we import. You can see it at the petrol barrels are now writ large. And I think this is going to become a political issue.
Well, it could feed into higher inflation again.
The only person who's actually happy about it is the Treasurer, because he taxes foreign resources profits earned in US dollars in Australian dollars, which are getting weaker. So it's one of the reasons he keeps finding all this additional revenue.
There you go. Laura?
We've been talking about how all the various bits fit together. You've mentioned we've got this IR legislation coming up from Tony Burke this week. We've also got a mass of reviews, all the full employment white paper, all the migration stuff, which I mentioned earlier in the program. And it's interesting, also the NDIS. And I think one of the legs of the IR bill or legislation we're about to see goes to the gig economy. Now, this is supposed to have originally been about all those poor guys who were being killed, when delivering their Uber Eats, and the Uber economy. I think it's going to be as significant for the NDIS workforce, which is, of course, exploded and is working in all sorts of ways which aren't necessarily good for anybody. So I think whether it's Qantas or the NDIS workforce, this IR legislation could actually be more significant than we've probably been focusing on until now.
We will see. It's going to be an interesting week ahead. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, remember Pistol and Boo, the two Yorkshire Terriers, illegally brought into the country by Amber Heard 8 years ago. There was a weird apology video from her and Johnny Depp, then claims that Heard had lied about her actions. Well, the Australian government this week dropped all charges, bringing this ongoing saga to an end. We'll leave you with the Agriculture Minister's explanation. Thanks for watching.
Our department worked with the Commonwealth Director of Prosecutions on it, and the DPP decided that there simply it wouldn't succeed as a case. So for that reason, it has been dropped. But the important thing is that Australian biosecurity was upheld at the time, and it will always be, no matter which party is in government.
OK. All right. Well, Amber Heard might be grateful for small mercies. I know with the acquisition of another dog, she named it Barnaby. Let's wait and see if future additions to the family include mutts called Murray.
You You're making us all feel very excited about being here.